So last week we took a brief hiatus so we could focus on mysteries of alien visitors and abductions. But this week we are back in My Teacher is an Alien, focusing on our skills of the week, really getting into the nitty-gritty of how authors communicate through the words that they choose. And along the way, we'll start to decipher some of the words that maybe we haven't recognized prior. Today, we're starting in Chapter 6, Drafting Peter. I sat at my desk and stared at the note. What was going on? Was Broxholm playing with me? For a moment, the thought that he was actually being a nice guy crossed my mind. I brushed it away. Nice guys don't kidnap sixth graders and drag them into outer space. I decided it was more likely he was just sending me a message. Got your number, kid. Don't mess with me. I was so wrapped up in trying to figure out what was going on that I could barely concentrate on my work. Most of the time, I just sat and stared at Broxholm's face, trying to figure out how the mask was attached. When I started to wonder if there was any way I could pull it off, my imagination began cooking up a horrifying scene. In this daydream, I saw myself grab Broxholm's ears and begin pulling on them, trying to unmask him. Only the mask wouldn't come off, so I pulled harder. Suddenly, his face began to stretch and twist all out of shape, but still the mask wouldn't come off. It was gross. Stop it, I told my brain firmly, but the vision kept coming back. Sometimes I wonder about my brain. I mean, it seems to have a mind of its own. If it was really my brain, you'd think I'd have a little bit more control over it, wouldn't you? When you get right down to it, brains are pretty weird. But not as weird as having an alien for a teacher. By the middle of the morning, I was beginning to wonder if this whole alien business had been a bad dream. It seemed too impossible to believe. But I knew I hadn't been dreaming. It was real. My teacher was an alien. I couldn't wait to get Peter aside so I could talk to him. When recess came, I tried to act calm as I wandered over to the hall where Peter usually sat to read. He was sitting on the ground, cross-legged, clutching a book called A Princess of Mars in his skinny hands. I slid down the wall and sat beside him. He acted as if he didn't notice me. Or maybe he really didn't. He was one of those kids who could get so wrapped up in a book, it would take a bomb to break his attention. I hated to interrupt him. Peter always seemed a little unhappy to me. Like he understood that he just didn't fit in with the rest of us. The only thing I knew that made him happy was reading science fiction. He always had a book hidden behind his school book. The neat thing was, it didn't make any difference because he was so bright that whenever the teacher asked him a question, he always knew the answer. I could never figure out why they wouldn't just leave him alone and let him read. But that's the way school is, I guess. So, what's going on? I said. What a stupid line. I'm glad I'm a girl, because when I get older, the guys are going to have to come up with lines when they want to start a conversation. Now, there's one job I'll be glad to let them have. Peter lifted his nose out of the book and looked at me as if I were the alien. He blinked, and I realized he was trying to come back to the real world. I felt bad for interrupting him. In class, he had to read with one eye on the teacher. Out here, he probably planned on shutting everything out for a while. I hesitated for a minute. How was I going to say this? Finally, I just decided to jump right in. I need your help, I said. Peter looked surprised. For what? He asked. I realized I hadn't jumped in after all. The biggie was still to come. Promise you won't laugh at me? I asked. Peter shrugged. Sure, I promise. All right, listen, I know you're not going to believe this, but I found out something awful yesterday. Mr. Smith is an alien. He's come here to kidnap a bunch of kids and take them back to outer space. I held my breath to see what Peter would say. I thought he might laugh or tell me to get lost, or this thought really scared me, shouted out to everyone else. To my astonishment, he didn't do any of those things. He just looked as if he was going to cry. "What's the matter?" I asked. "You should know," he said. He sniffed and wiped the back of his hand across his nose. What was going on here? I had the sudden thought that maybe he was an alien too. That was stupid, of course, because I had aliens on the brain and couldn't figure out what else it might be. "I don't know," I said. "Honest, I don't." He looked at me and his eyes were so sad they made me want to cry too. "I always thought you were the one kid in this class who was on my side," he said. "Like that time you tried to stop Duncan when he was beating me up. I expect everyone else to tease me. I just never thought you would do it." Now it was my turn to be mad. "I'm not teasing," I yelled. Then I lowered my voice. "I'm not teasing," I hissed. "I'm serious." Peter stared at me. "Is this some kind of game?" he asked. I hesitated. If I told him the truth, he probably wouldn't believe me. If I told him it was a game, he might at least help me think things through. What a fix. The only way I could get him to believe me was to lie to him. "Yeah," I said. "I thought you were the one guy in the class with enough imagination to play. But now you've ruined it." "No," said Peter. "We can still play. Just pretend you had to tell me it was a game to get me to believe you." My head was starting to spin. Peter was using my reason for lying as the reason to pretend that what he believed was a game for real. For something like that. It was getting too complicated for me. This is going to be one of those weeks, I thought. The only person I can count on for help stopping an alien invasion thinks the whole thing is a game. Well, as my grandmother always says, you make do with what you've got. And Peter was what I had. I decided to stop worrying about who was believing what and just tell him what had happened. "Well," I said when I was done, "what do you think we should do?" Peter stared at the sky for a minute. He rubbed his chin as if he was thinking really hard. Then he gave me his answer. "We've got no choice," he said. "We'll have to break into Broxham's house to look for evidence." Chapter 7, Night Expedition. Peter was right, of course. That was the worst thing about it. And what did I say? Now that I had someone who was willing to help me and had actually given me some good advice, did I say, "Thank you very much"? Are you kidding? I looked at him and said, "You have got to be out of your mind." "I am not," said Peter indignantly. "If we're going to do anything about Broxham, we have to get proof. And the only proof is to get into his house and find some." I thought about that. I couldn't come up with any way around it. How else could we find proof that we were telling the truth? Then I thought of something else. "I don't think it will do any good," I said. "There's not much in there. He doesn't have any furniture or anything." "How do you know that?" "I told you I was in there yesterday." "Oh yeah," said Peter. "I forgot." I could tell he still thought I was making this up. "Did you see the whole place?" he asked. I shook my head. "Well, maybe there's something in his bedroom," he said, "or the attic, or the kitchen." His face lit up. "That's it! The kitchen! Who knows what they eat on the planet he comes from? I bet we'll find all kinds of gross alien slime in his refrigerator." "Peter, you're brilliant," I said. I was actually just starting to feel hopeful. All we needed was just one thing that would prove I wasn't making all this up. "Now, when can we do it?" I asked. "We can't let him catch us." Peter thought for a minute. "There's a PTA meeting tomorrow night," he said. "I heard Dr. Bleekman say that all the teachers have to be there. That's the only time we can be sure Broxholm will be out of his house. Tomorrow it is, I said. That was Wednesday. By the time Thursday afternoon rolled around, I was a wreck. I'd spent 2 full days sitting in that classroom staring at Mr. Smith and knowing his handsome face was only a mask that hid the terrifying face of an alien. While none of the other kids were crazy about Mr. Smith, they didn't think there was anything really wrong with him. Only Peter knew the secret, and he thought it was a game I had invented. What about Dr. Bleakman, he asked. He said to me during the afternoon recess. What about him, I asked. Do you think he's in cahoots with Broxholm? They seem pretty chummy. I shook my head. My mother told me Dr. Bleakman was really angry with Miss Schwartz for quitting so suddenly. He wouldn't have been so upset if he'd been wanting to put Broxholm in her place. Peter looked at me in astonishment. Don't you know a cover story when you hear one? He asked. Of course he acted like he was upset. If he hadn't, it would have been suspicious. The way I figure it, Broxholm asked Dr. Bleakman which teacher he wanted to get rid of the most. Then he zapped Miss Schwartz, so there would be a spot for him to fill. I felt like there were ants crawling on my skin. Peter was just playing a game, but what he had said made too much sense. Too much sense. I still couldn't believe that Miss Schwartz had just quit without saying anything to us. Something must have happened to her. My head was whirling. Was Dr. Bleakman really in on the whole thing? Had Broxholm really fried Miss Schwartz? If so, what would happen if he caught Peter and me in his house? If Broxholm found some way to get himself excused and came home early to catch us rummaging through his house, would he zap us too? That last question really terrified me. But if the ideas Peter was spinning out were true, it was more important than ever that we unmask Broxholm. How are you going to get out tonight? I asked. Peter. What do you mean? He asked. What do you mean, what do I mean? How are you going to get out of your house tonight? I had no problem myself. My parents were officers in the PTA. They always went to meetings. They decided at the beginning of the year that I was too old for a babysitter, so as long as I was back before they got home, it wouldn't make any difference. I didn't really like sneaking out on them, but this was a matter of life and death. Peter looked at me in surprise. Are you really planning to break into Mr. Smith's house? He asked. His name isn't Mr. Smith, I said. It's Broxholm. And yes, I'm really planning to search his house. I couldn't bring myself to call it a break-in. I have to find some way to prove what he really is. Peter looked troubled. He rubbed his hands over his skinny face. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said, This isn't a game, is it? I shook my head. Peter's eyes got wide. He swallowed a couple times, then he took a deep breath and said, Don't worry, I'll be there. I could have hugged him. That night, I met Peter at 8 o'clock on the corner of Pine and Main. He was carrying a flashlight, which made me feel stupid since I had forgotten mine. It was nearly dark, the crickets were singing, and the moon had already risen. Even though it was May, it was cold. Or maybe I was just cold because I was scared. Ready? I asked. Peter nodded. Ready, he said. We each took a deep breath. Then we set off for the alien's house. I was afraid you might not come, I said after we had gone a few blocks. Peter shrugged. I didn't want you doing this alone, he said. For a while I was afraid you were trying to pull a joke on me. I thought when I got to the corner, you and some of the others might jump out and start laughing at me. Hey, I said, I wouldn't do something like that. I didn't think so, said Peter. That was one of the reasons I came. The other reason was, I figured if you were really going to break into Mr. Smith's house, this must be for real. You're not the kind of kid who would do something like that unless it was serious. Believe me, I said, this is serious. I believe you, he said nervously. We didn't say anything else until we got to Broxham's house. Well, said Peter, here we are. Here we are, I echoed, but neither of us moved. We just stood there at the dark, empty house. I don't know about Peter, but I was trying to talk myself into taking the next step. To tell the truth, I was so scared I thought I might wet my pants.